kick us off, before I ask Gwynne to give us a brief synopsis, I wanted to set the table a little bit when it comes to what we're doing here in Canada when it comes to automation. Because this isn't something that's necessarily new, right? It's present in businesses big and small. And I would say, it seems like we're betting kind of big on automation right now. In July, the government made a nearly $50 million investment in the Canada Agri-Food Automation and Intelligence Network to accelerate automation and digitize Canada's agricultural sector. This funding is part of a $108.5 million that the network received. And last year, the government also announced a $50 million funding competition to advance automation and digital technology. This announcement was preceded by the greenhouse gas industry receiving $5 million, not as much, but targeted to advance robotics in greenhouses to, I kid you not, harvest cucumbers at their perfect ripeness, gently picking the vegetables and preparing them to be shipped out to consumers. So I wanted to flag that because it's useful and it's important for this conversation for us to distinguish between automation and artificial intelligence. Automation is software that follows pre-programmed rules. Maybe many of you in the room are working on projects or at startups or firms that engage with this work. Artificial intelligence is designed to simulate human thinking, so automation in this context refers to the impact of artificial intelligence on tasks that only humans can perform today. Examples, I won't be exhaustive, but self-checkout at a grocery store, if anyone's been to TIFF, or printing out your own movie ticket, checking yourself out of a parking lot. These are all instances of automation, right? It's not just something that's ahead of us or nebulous in the future. And concerns over automation and joblessness, not necessarily making the connection to democracy, actually aren't that historically new. During the 1950s and early 60s in the US, the concerns were strong enough that in '64, President Lyndon B. Johnson impaneled a blue ribbon National Commission on Technology, Automation, and Economic Progress. Honestly, that sounds like something we could announce tomorrow, or that I could see, in a party platform here in Canada, to confront the productivity problem of that period. And I stole this from Alex Usher's Twitter, actually, but he had done some work going back in time looking at different party platforms, and he found similar language. So I don't say this to discount our conversation by any means, but I do want to contextualize it and flag that, this isn't a 2019 only debate, but the nuances and the opportunities and the examples of this debate are what's really important. So Gwynne, in your book, and from that blue panel, here's what they concluded. The basic fact is that technology eliminates jobs, not work. We'll talk about that. So in your book, the one we're selling at the back, the one of many you've written, you write that you believe that human history is best seen as an experiment to determine whether a species that evolved to live in quite small groups, almost always less than 100 people, can successfully live in societies many millions strong. These enormous societies are the basis of our civilization and the source of all our technological prowess, but they are certainly not natural. And the question of how to run them has always been problematic. How's the experiment going?
Ooh. Actually not bad. If you take the long sweep of history, it's about 8,000 years of bad news, followed by a couple of centuries of much better news, in the sense that from the time we started civilization, we had god kings and slaves and militarization and so on. We still got the militarization, but that's 1 out of 3. The other 2 we've done pretty well with. Mm-hmm. I think there are reasons for that, and the ability to communicate across a large society, mass media, even just literacy in books and pamphlets, has enabled us to reclaim what I would say is our evolutionary heritage, because until we started farming, everybody lived in small, very egalitarian groups. So it's sort of fundamental to us. And if you look at our personal lives, even in the worst darkness of the thousands of years of empire, people had small groups of people, about the same number of people you'd have known in a hunter-gatherer group, and they treat each other as equals. So it's kind of basic. Now we can treat much larger numbers of people as equals. You don't even have to know them, and we have devised ways of doing that. So I think the experiment's doing very well historically, but at the moment we're running into a little bit of a problem, which is, well, it's more than automation, but it is automation. Automation does destroy jobs, and we tell the high school students that that's all right because it creates other jobs over here, and if you just upgrade your skills, you'll be fine. Yeah, about a third of you. But, you know, for every 3 jobs destroyed, 1 created is not a good ratio, and that's about what we're looking at. I think it's unstoppable in the sense that anybody who is in a capitalist society and employing labor is going to want to minimize the wage bill, and besides, robots don't push back. You know, no Monday cars, no washroom breaks, no paid annual holiday, and no lawsuits if you get mangled in an industrial accident. So, you know, of course it's going to go on. But we do therefore have a problem, and I think it's coming out in our politics. Mr. Trump and Mr. Johnson in England and so on, if you look at where they got elected from the parts of the country where automation has already been destroying jobs, mainly because factories are very easy to automate, for 20 years. So the automation directly impacts on democracy. It makes people desperate and ready to listen to any charlatan who comes along with a false but attractive explanation, which generally involves nasty behavior. So that's where we are, I think.
Okay. Sheila and Chuka, you've both been thinking about automation and technology and jobs. What's your perspective when it comes to how we should be thinking about this question and these risks? It's like, who wants to make more eye contact with me? Sheila. I choose you, and I'll pour water here.
Okay, probably safer.
So I think if I loved Gwynne's long view, and I think if we take a long view and we take a look at economic history is essentially the story of technological change. From the sort of classic example of the introduction of automatic looms that resulted in the Luddite movement of those who rebelled against it. And there have been many, many predictions that we are facing the end of work as a result of technological change. And in fact, we haven't. And overall employment rates and employment continues to increase. And I think one of the ways to think about technological change that's kind of very present in our day-to-day life is to look at the impact of online shopping, right? And so online shopping might really reduce the demand for labor for retail clerks in physical shopping malls. But what it does do is it increases the demand for people working in warehouses and Amazon warehouses, among others, and also for drivers to deliver this. So I think for me, the question is really a crisis rather than of work, a crisis in job quality. And so if we replace sort of one set of bad jobs with another set of bad jobs, that's a question that I think we have to really look at. And I think when we also look at the displacement and we look at how those jobs became good jobs, the losses in factories, the losses in production, those jobs didn't start out as good jobs. Those jobs started out as dangerous and dirty and poorly paid jobs. And I think one of the real keys to that was increasing unionization, right, of those jobs that could transform those jobs from bad jobs into good jobs. And I think at that point I'll stop for the moment.
I was like, we're going to come back to you. You're not done, but thank you.
I'll pause.
We'll focus on displacement and the quality of those jobs.
And so I would agree very much that the quality of the job is especially important. And as you mentioned, the increase in online shopping I think that for me, the fundamental question is who controls the process of automation and to what end? So in regards to the example of online shopping, it can increase workers in warehouses, it can increase delivery workers, it can also introduce task differentiation within like shopping centers and grocery stores as well. However, it goes back to the question of capitalist control of the process of automation, because if those workers are in control of it, then they can reap those benefits without displacing themselves or other workers. And I think it's important to note that as you mentioned, as both of you mentioned, some of the first industries that have been automated are, labor jobs, factory workers, and those are jobs with deep and long histories of worker organizing. And so undercutting that organizing, undercutting those unions, of course, reaps further benefits to the employer, to the controller of the workplace. And I think that automation, and as well, it's important to note that our ability to gather data about tasks that are performed in various workplaces is increasing rapidly. And so as we gather more data, and of course employers can introduce systems that automatically gather this data, then they have further capacity to automate jobs, which we previously thought it would be very difficult to automate.
So it's easy to automate jobs.
I wouldn't say that it's easy. I would say that the more data you have about a particular job, the more data you have about the various tasks that are involved in performing a particular job, then the greater capacity there is to automate that job. And since our ability to gather data is increasing rapidly, the capacity to automate jobs is also increasing rapidly.
Okay, I want to pick up a little bit on the ownership piece. So who owns? Is that speaking to the intellectual property of the automation? Where we're seeing already with IP and tech, we're seeing income inequality grow and fewer people be employed in these larger companies than, the previous top 10 companies. Is this about workers having ownership? Is this about envisioning more of a future of labor? I'd like to dig in a little bit to that and kind of circle around too.
So I was speaking primarily about workers controlling the process of automation. So workers controlling the process by which automated systems are introduced into the workplace and introduced into labor tasks. Because even if increasing automation or mechanization into a job doesn't displace the job entirely, it does fundamentally change the job, change the tasks that are done. And I mean, in the case of Amazon workers, even though there are still workers in those warehouses, they are governed by machines. They have like a pod with them that sets particular timelines for every task and a list of tasks that they have to go through. And that structure is horrific, and the circumstances that they endure in those workplaces are quite stark and appalling in many cases. And so I think it's a question of worker control of the process of automation. I think the argument for worker control of the workplace overall or the enterprise overall is also a very compelling one. But I think that, and that of course would create worker control of the process automation implicitly. But I don't think that you have to have worker control of the enterprise or the workplace to have worker control of the process automation, but I certainly would argue that is something compelling and something worth pursuing.
There's a sequence here. Actually, the breaking of the unions occurred before automation. It dates back to the beginning of the 1980s. And I don't think they were sufficiently foresighted to see that was the advantage they were going to give themselves in an automating world in the late 90s and the early decade of this century. But you do have to address that whole question, which is actually part of the neoliberal paradigm, which I do tend to believe in 40-year cycles, because that's about a full generation of experience, and you never do what your parents did. They were clearly wrong. So that allows you to get round the corner and do something different. And if you think about it, I mean, I'm offering a little bit of hope here now. If you think about it, the first 35 years after the Second World War, when we built the welfare states, and that's when we built them, were also a period where, by and large, as the economy expanded, wages, incomes went up alongside it. I mean, it was never an equal distribution of wealth, but it didn't change between 1945 and 1975. And, sort of 10% of the population had a third of the income, but the rest of it's, that's not that bad, 66% for 90% of the people. And then you hit sort of, Friedrich, Hayek, and Milton Friedman, and neoliberalism, and all that. And a whole different paradigm is introduced. Initially, by the way, on the excuse that they were fighting inflation. And so you now have another 35 years in which we have had capitalism triumphant in a way that it was not. Nobody's building welfare states now, and they're busy tearing down the ones we've got, and the unions fighting a rearguard battle. But again, 35 years, I actually think it might be time that, and we certainly have motivation here to get back to some kind of worker control of the circumstances that they live in and work in. You do have this automation problem, which is really a difficult one. But at least I think, my sense is that, I can't quote you examples in terms of evidence, oh, look, it's changing. But it does feel like the wind is changing. Does that seem to you as well?
I want to find out if Sheila shares that optimism. But I also want to say, aren't there parts of everyone's job that it would be such a relief if they got automated and you didn't have to do them anymore? Do you share his optimism?
Well, I loved your optimism in your book, and I loved the kind of long view that you had in your book. And I think I share your optimism in terms of a sense of possibility, because I don't believe that there's anything in the economic or technological landscape that prevents us from democratically taking control of these processes through government. And I think there are solutions in terms of actual regulation, and part of that has to do with regulating the labor market and having labor market regulation kind of catch up to the technological changes. We have two examples of that happening this week, one of which was California, where they have defined workers who are working, gig workers on platform, who are working off of the platforms, are being defined as employees as opposed to independent contractors. And while that might seem like a kind of arcane legal difference, what that actually means is that these people have the rights and responsibilities of employees. And the employer has the rights and responsibilities of employers with regard to those workers. Similarly, in Ontario, we have an application for certification for the workers at food stores. Is that? Foodora.
They are the food stores.
They are the food stores, the food stores for Foodora. So again, this is trying to catch up legislation, trying to catch the legislation up with what's actually happening out in the real world. So I think there are, I think, solutions to these kinds of problems that we're facing in terms of the huge increase in income inequality that are not impossible and that are not things that we have not yet thought of, but really require us to have an expanded idea and role for government.
While we're doing all this, and I'm all in favor of doing it, the jobs really are disappearing. It's not just, the typical trajectory of an automobile worker in Detroit over the past 20 years is you lose your well-paid job. They didn't actually move it to Mexico. They just brought in the robot arms. And you got, the big factories in Detroit are still churning out cars. Just look at the employee parking lots around the back. They're 9/10 empty. And so you lose that job, but you don't lose, if you're under 50, you still have a job of some sort, but now it's a minimum wage job or near. And then you'll age out of that, or they'll automate that in the end. But there is a real loss of jobs. The Industrial Revolution, you got moved off the farm into the factory, you changed your job, but there was still a job at the end of the day. That's not what's happening now. We are moving, I think, towards an era in which full employment is a fantasy. And it's quite imaginable. I mean, I was on a panel quite recently with an English guy called Carl Frey, who was one of the team who in 2013 did the study that predicted 47% of jobs in the United States vulnerable to automation in 20 years. Well, we're 6 years into that now, and we're tracking pretty well.
It's a very hot thing for policymakers to become this predictive. I feel like the profession is as
In real life, he's not
looking
quite
ahead.
so,
It's
yeah.
risky, right?
Yeah,
It's quite risky.
But it did get the donkey's attention. You know?
Fair, fair.
And so you can argue about what the numbers are, 47%, 37%, 57%. You can argue about how fast it goes. You can certainly try to bring in regulation to slow it down. And, you know, this whole business about private contractors, the sort of, you know, you work for me, but I don't have any responsibilities to you because you don't legally work for me. You can do all of that, but at the end of the day, there's still going to be a lot of people who, there will be a lot more people than there are jobs. Now, that doesn't mean any, you know, I mean, there's many ways you can attack that then, one of which is job sharing in various ways. You can look at universal basic income, which came up right away as soon as you had, Mr. Trump was elected, they went, pissed off workers elected him. Desperate former workers elected him. We better talk about universal basic income. 2 months and it was out on the table. It was quite interesting. And then it was on the table here in Ontario until the government changed.
Yeah. We can talk about, we'll get to basic income too. I think it's worth touching on in terms of policy responses. I mean, in Canada, I do think automation has a certain invisibility. So on the one hand, we're investing in it. If we're creating the technologies that cause automation, you know, that can help the economy in the short term at least. We're also posting record job growth. So again, how do we make the nuances when it's not a straight substitution from automation, but it's an iteration? How do we make these changes more visible? How do we generate a language around it? You know, I'm very cautious as a policy person to make predictions, but I like how you do it with like such conviction, and I want to work on that. I can tell you this much, no matter how much data these firms are collecting, which I don't know how they're getting consent, policymakers will say, we don't have enough data. So given the data that we have, Sheila, are you seeing these drastic sort of substitution effects? Do you see them on the horizon when you're doing your own analysis at the CCPA or elsewhere?
So I think this is where I kind of fundamentally depart from your analysis here, is that what I see is we have record low unemployment rates. We have increasing employment, and there are two issues that I think are really important, and you touch on both of them. One of which is whenever you have that kind of technological change, which economic theory tells you increases productivity, you have a very concentrated group of people who suffer the losses and the consequences as a result of it. And absolutely, production workers are the people who are suffering those consequences. And rather than having them have to bear that burden individually, we need to share that and we need to support them because we are all kind of collectively benefiting from those increases in productivity. So I think that's absolutely true that people who are midway in their careers, right? So you've been working on the line for 20 years, and the seniority list, you know, in Oshawa, and the seniority list keeps on kind of getting shaved down. You are not only losing your job, but you are kind of falling off a cliff in terms of your employment possibilities. And then the kind of classic thing that happens is you wind up being a Walmart greeter. And that particularly happens for unskilled workers, right? So if you've got a trade, if you're a skilled tradesperson, you can lose a lot if you lose a unionized regular job at a large plant, but you have other places to go. That's really not the case if you're an unskilled worker. So absolutely, there are big losses. Those are concentrated, and we really should socialize those losses. But the other part of it is I think overall what we're seeing in labor markets and what we're seeing in employment growth is it's kind of like a barbell. So you see large growth, highly skilled, highly paid jobs, and you see a lot of growth in low skilled, low paid jobs. And that middle from those golden years between 45 and 1975, there's been this hollowing out. And I think that's why, rather than an emphasis on how do we increase the quantity of work, it's really about what do we do about quality of work. And in terms of the kind of technological end of it, one of the things that I would really worry about is what Chuka talked about, which is the increase in surveillance, right?
Yeah.
And how that really is kind of demeaning and dehumanizing in all kinds of workplaces. And what we need is regulation again to catch up with that,
Of course.
to protect people from that.
Yeah. Chuka, I want to let you respond to this, but I also wanted to make sure we save a slice of time to talk about ports. We were chatting about ports before, not the wine, the ones with boats and shipping, because again, when it comes back to the invisibility or kind of our challenges detecting where automation is happening, it's not happening evenly across the labor force. We've touched on the service industry. Previously, we thought service industry, hey, pretty resilient. You can't offshore your haircut.
Right.
And now we're seeing changes. We're seeing some in retail. And previously, those policymakers shaking the magic 8 ball, they weren't really calling that or kind of bracing us for that. Tell us what's happening with ports or a port, and then feel free to touch on anything we've been chatting about over here, because I didn't loop you in. I'm really sorry.
No worries. So there was a economic impact study recently released by the International Longshore and Warehouse Union Canada. They worked with Prism Economics to develop it, and they found that over the next 50 years, I believe, automation of ports threatens or directly impacts the work of between 50 and 90% of workers at ports. And there are already fully automated ports, particularly in Rotterdam and in China. And there are ports in China that some of the automated systems that they've introduced are directed by workers in the Philippines. And so this goes to the digital platforms that you were talking about, in that you can not just, in pushing the work to an automated system, you can further undercut workers in the immediate environment by having workers outside of the country, even certainly outside of the bargaining unit, provide that labor. And so I think what you mentioned about socializing the gains, socializing the losses, because research conducted on the impact in automation in the U.S. and in the EU has shown that the job polarization that you were talking about, there's a decrease in the share of the labor force in like production and labor work, and there's an increase in interpersonal service and provision of care work, and then an increase in professional and managerial and technical work. Of course, the costs of attaining the education required to get into that sort of professional managerial class work are not insignificant. And so in the same way that we should socialize the losses, I think there's also an argument, and this goes to the sort of governmental response that you discussed, of socializing the gains, right? Making the increases in output, the increases in efficiency and capacity, and therefore the increases in revenue and profits, make those gains benefit the entirety of society, whether it's through further taxation, whether it's through public control to some degree. There are ways of making those benefits and those increases benefit the rest of society as well, because otherwise, if you have this loss in that sector of work that has the sort of deepest history of worker organizing, that over decades has established better and better collective agreements, and that is in many cases most representative of the good paying family supporting jobs, then if that share of the labor force decreases, then all of the public revenues that come from the taxation of that income also decrease. And so then you're looking at a situation where public revenues are increasingly reliant upon the corporate sector, a sector that is, and I would argue, drastically undertaxed. But if the government ends up relying upon taxation of that sector for public revenues, that just increases the control and input that sector has over public policy. And that certainly, I think, strikes at the fundamental structure of democracy.
So we've talked about businesses. I've made a lot of fun of policymakers. We're really implicitly appealing to regulators here. We've talked about workers. We haven't talked about the role of consumers here, if at all. So as we see automation proliferate, spread, whatever adjective I should use here, across the workplace, no matter how uneven, no matter how sudden. Is there a role for consumers in terms of demanding more of that line of sight? Is it going to be, do we foresee a movement concurrent to labor improvements where people will want to know the proportion of automation involved in making or delivering something in the way that we saw consumers push for better changes with anti-sweatshop or fair trade movements? Or is the consumer the villain here? Are we driving some of these detrimental substitutions by ordering my groceries online or going on Amazon, getting all of Gwynne's books, getting them delivered? It's going to be a bunch of different packages. Then there's more traffic. Sheila's late to her meeting. What's the role of the consumer?
Well, I never use the automated checkout at the supermarket. But I still have these conversations I live around the corner from the supermarket. I use it as my corner shop.
Okay.
And so I know all, the checkout people, and you notice the lady with the one who always laughs with the hijab isn't here anymore. Mm-hmm. But there's another row of these checkouts. Mm-hmm. You can push back in little ways, but I think to push back effectively, you need to be organized. It needs to be something that people sort of sign up to do in their own minds, at least. Mm-hmm. And because if you don't have a lot of people doing it, you're lost in the undergrowth there. AI, which we touched upon, is actually hitting different sectors of the workforce now. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's going at the moment, apart from retail jobs, which are going now as fast as factory jobs were going 20 years ago. But back office services, the ones that weren't outsourced to India 20 years ago, in legal practices, medical practices, they're going now. Insurance firms, anything that's highly repetitive, even if it requires quite a high level of education, can be and will be automated. Most people in those jobs aren't organized anyway. The question occurs to me, and I don't know the answer to this. I know it for some other countries, but I don't know it for Canada, and the numbers may not be there. I have the impression that a growing proportion of the jobs are occupied, the jobs that exist, and as you say, if you believe the unemployment numbers, which I don't, then we're doing fairly well. But what proportion of the people in those jobs have education that would qualify them for a higher skilled job, if there were one available? Okay. I mean, I think that's a really important way of gauging what's happening to work, but I don't have an answer for it. Do you know?
I think Vass might know, actually.
You know what? I have a concern when it comes to reskilling, because here in Canada, here in Toronto, we have the Future Skills Centre at Ryerson 2. The government, again, this current federal government, even though we're going into an election, we're placing a big premium on skills and lifelong learning. And I do think there's a very big risk in terms of predatory colleges. Who really, I like learning too forever, but I don't always want to pay for it, right? I don't want to have to go on LinkedIn and always pay tons of money to put badges on. And when you look at, it's true, I don't. You know what, I also chaired a federal panel on youth employment, which is maybe why Sheila was I think Vass knows, she's not straight trolling me. She was giving me an opportunity, and I will offer that with the digitization of the labor market, which is historically new, we have even more pressure, especially with entry-level jobs, that we partially could either solve with automation and matching, but with lifelong learning and more skills. When you look over time, what do CEOs want? What do businesses want? What skills do they want? The same skills over time: creativity, problem solving, and communication. Those are very difficult, if not impossible, to credentialize, and they are what make people more resilient as workers and flexible in the workforce. Because you mentioned, Gwen, what we tell teenagers. Oh, it must be terrible to be in a careers class, right? The jobs you'll apply for don't even exist today. You've got to participate in the community. And then we tell them this fairy tale. The fairy tale is that you apply to a job with a resume and a cover letter, and someone calls you back. I don't think that's true anymore. No, I don't. because the labor market's also becoming more invisible, because with entry-level work, we've pointed to populism as, it's going to, if it's on the horizon, that it's going to come from displaced, disgruntled workers. I'll offer, since I just became a panelist, that, a population at risk of demonstrating some populism are young people who are going to be immediately discouraged about the labor force, because we tell them to get a summer job. Well, guess what? If they get a summer job, it's not related to what they're studying. It totally sucks. They graduate, it's hard to solve for the experience gap. And then you take this shotgun approach, apply, that is familiar to many of us. And then you're not even getting, that delayed entry to the labor force can be super alienating, and for so many people, this is their first experience with work.
And
Sorry, I was just going to say.
You be the moderator now.
But you can.
I'm sorry.
You can almost define the experience of people in the workforce by their age. If you're over 35 now, you probably got into the workforce before this phenomenon really took off, and you've had a reasonably comfortable time as you rose up through the ranks. My youngest daughter is 27, and her friends are not having that experience. They've all finished university, they're in London, there should be lots of jobs, but unpaid internships one after another. It's really hard to be in your 20s now. And that tells you something about how it's reshaping.
And I would want to add that, of course, when you do enter the workforce, or when you do finish university or a college or what have you, in many cases you have significant amounts of student debt, which, all of that, not just, it doesn't just like sort of economically impair you, it also like increases stress, anxiety, all of these things that are physiologically harmful. And then, of course, as there's increased competition for particular jobs, there's also increased capacity to make those jobs precarious, right? To make them short-term contracts or unpaid internships, and further way to sort of extract labor from people without providing them a meaningful security in their life. And also, and this is an attached issue, is that the more that education is looked to as the solution for these issues in the labor market, then education is increasingly defined by employers. And while education, of course, is important as a means of finding your way in the world, I would argue that there's also a self-actualizing aspect that's important to preserve. That education is also a means of understanding the world and thinking about the world and your place in it and your own life, and all of those things are great, treasures of self-aware consciousness, and we shouldn't tilt education entirely towards training people for wage labor.
I mean, it's a response. It doesn't address some of the structural changes and forces that we've been talking about. I don't know if you guys remember, I totally lied earlier. Remember I said we were going to talk about basic income? Right. I was just going to use that maybe as a way we could look forward either to the election or more of the policies and thinking that we need. It can come from any sector. But I mean, back to the younger generation too. I mean, forget how we could potentially pay for basic income. We need to have a generation that can pay for another generation's healthcare costs. We need a generation that can afford to buy houses that have gone up so far in value that people are also undersaving for retirement, banking on someone buying that house. I don't know who's going to buy them. So we're going into an election. Are we going to be able to talk about, as Canadians, I know you have Canadian roots, even though you came from London when you took a break from the supermarket. Are we going to be able to actually touch on these forces, these things? And if we want to think about policy solutions, how do we go beyond or complement the thinking behind universal basic income?
What?
Go ahead.
Well, I can say quickly.
Sure.
On the universal basic income, I would say that if it's an increase in the social wage, if it's something that doesn't replace existing social programs, which I would argue should be increased, then there's benefits to it and it's compelling. If it's meant to replace the social safety net and all social programs, that is, I would argue, an extremely regressive proposal. In terms of paying for these responses, I think that there are proposals. I mean, there's an active proposal for a wealth tax that would, I think, net something like I believe it's like $6 to $9 billion a year, but It could be more than that even. Anyway, I think
600 billion?
6 to 9.
Okay.
Right.
I was like, I've never thought of that number
No,
before.
but,
6 to 9 billion.
Yeah,
Got
but so I think that there are ways to pay for it, but given this context of increasing inequality, drastically increasing inequality, it is a question of socializing the gains and socializing the aspects of our society that are producing those gains. And that, of course, with those proceeds, you could also fund education or provide education tuition free, provide textbooks and things like that, so that more people have capacity to gather whatever skills or learning that they need to attempt to find security in this world and find a place in the labor market.
Back to the business of equality. Do you know what I think the main difference is between Canada's response politically to automation, to the change in which politically has been reasonable and moderate and compared to some other countries I could mention, pretty effective.
Okay.
And let us say the United States, it's directly linked to income differentials, to the gap between the rich and the rest. I mean, the number that really struck me, I recite it in my sleep, but when I first heard it, the gap between incomes of the top 20% of the population and the bottom 20% on income in the United States is 8 times. In Canada, it's 5.5. That's a vast difference. We're doing something right here. And in terms of narrowing that gap, which breeds frustration, resentment, and desperation, in terms of narrowing that gap, while there are many things you could and should do, any kind of basic income is a magic wand because it raises the level of everybody closer to where it narrows the gap. Mm-hmm. I think that is something. It in itself is almost an argument for some sort of basic income.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that I want to touch on this. I think the idea of education being the solution to inequality, while I absolutely agree that it should be more accessible, is again a kind of very individualized solution here, and it tells people you just really should have gone to that computer engineering school at the University of Waterloo and you'd be fine. So I think we actually have solutions in our grasp, right? And my generation has been accused, I think rightly, of climbing up a ladder and then pulling it up behind us, right? And I think really the question is, again, what can we socialize and what can we provide publicly? And so if we actually had an expansion of public health care to pharmacare, and these are issues that are being talked about in the election, to mm-hmm. pharmacare and to dental care, if we have an expansion of affordable childcare, if we had an expansion of public investments in housing, those things that constitute a social wage, as we say, would really make a contribution to an increase in living standards and mm-hmm. a reduction in inequality. And I guess I have the same kind of hesitations that Chuka have, that in terms of looking at a universal basic income, you are just looking at kind of, you're looking at people's monetary incomes and you're not looking at what a provision of social services can give you. And the universality of social services make them, very appealing kind of across the electorate as well. And I think I have some hope if, the older you are, the more likely you are to vote. And if people are really seeing the impact that they feel that their children's chances in life or life is going to be more difficult, that we will turn back, as you say, over that kind of 35-year period and say we had something right there. Mm-hmm. And what's clearly we need to do along with that is we need to raise the money to pay for this. And raising taxes both pay for those services and also redistributes money in a progressive tax system. So I really see that increase in regulation, increase in the public and social provision of the things that we need day to day, and then raising the money as really kind of part of the solution that I'm hoping for in the next 40 days.